Right, so this is the first of our series on the psyche, focused on Aristotle. I'm really pleased that Jon Mills can host the discussion and say something to get us going, to sort of set the stage for what we're going to be thinking about. So, John, let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, David. I decided to prepare something a little bit more formal than just talk off the top of my head. So hopefully it won't be too long or banal. But because the ancients were preoccupied with the question of soul, that really has a prehistory to Aristotle. So I thought I would talk about the pre-Socratic types of reflections on the soul leading up to what Aristotle had to say, which is the most systematic treatise on the soul that was written in ancient times. And I only focused on the first two books, thinking that most people won't read it. So, but there is, of course, a rich discussion about many, many different types of aspects of what we call consciousness today in Aristotle that deserves attention. But for the early Greeks, as you likely already know, the soul was equated with breath, as is the Latin spiritus, derived from Byzantine Greek orthography, to breathe. Soul or spirit signifies life, which requires air. Mythos aside, what was common Greek opinion on the nature and qualities of the soul was originally conceived by or attributed to Thales as that which causes movement. Although the word psyche is popularly translated to soul, we may prefer to refer to it as the animator, due to its lack of theological undertones implicated with the word soul, as we also observe with the German word Seele. To have soul is to be animate or living, what Aristotle says, quote, by which primarily we live, perceive, and think, end quote. Hence, to have soul is to be alive, even in Hades, where dead souls reside in the underworld. The Greek conception of psyche may be said to ultimately be concerned with the essence of the human being and various dispositions, composites, or natures have been attributed to its organization. By today's standards, what we typically refer to as mind as a totality, including the unique features that comprise individual personality and subjectivity, the Greeks tended to emphasize its multimodal features as universal dimensions of the human condition. In other words, they were interested in what is common to us all. Because the notion of consciousness is a modern, not an ancient concept, early cultures did not have a word for the unconscious in the way that it's commonly used today. Therefore, the nature of soul was not examined in this light. But the unconscious depths of the soul were not entirely neglected, as many pre-Socratic philosophers attempted to delineate. Testimonia from Aristotle notes that it was Thales who attributed a motive force to the notion of the soul, hence a purpose or telos that animates mind as a life principle. For Anaximenes, our soul, quote, holds us together, what Democritus equates with thought, as well as, quote, a lust for pleasure, end quote. Perhaps it is in Heraclitus where we first get some glimpse of unconscious process when he points out that the soul follows an inner law of growth that has no limit, quote, such is the depth of its meaning, end quote. That's famous fragment 45. Yet one that is corrupted by impulsive desire. This is his term. For whatever it wants, it will buy at the cost of the soul, end quote. The desirous or lustful features of the soul were often separated from its more rational faculties attributed to the intellect, reason, or mind, nous, the bright jewel of which is wisdom. For the Pythagorean school, like the Egyptians, the soul was immortal. Life on earth was a sojourn and preparation through purification, self-discipline, and self-harmonization for entering the afterlife, the destiny of which was to prepare for eternity. And for Philolaus, a contemporary of Socrates, the immortal harmonia of the soul becomes, quote, incorporeal, end quote, as it separates from the body upon death. Because the ancients believed in reincarnation, metempsychosis, and transmigration of the soul, they believed that they had lived before and that learning or education was a matter of recollection. Philip Wheelwright, a scholastic and ancient scholar, explains, this is what he says: the fundamental truths are already known to us in the depths of our unconscious selves, and the purpose of education should therefore be to stir these hidden parts of us into activity, rather than impose truths upon them from outside sources, end quote. Here we can appreciate how the Socratic method of dialectic was designed to question truth claims imposed by others and elicit knowledge that was previously forgotten, such as was demonstrated in Plato's famous dialogue Meno. Plato's treatment of the psyche in his dialogues is vast and varied, but he takes up the Pythagorean concept of the soul as comprising three parts: intelligence, reason, and passion. He further then, in the Republic, discusses the desirous and appetitive soul as pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, and that the lawless, base, and beastly and savage parts, as he says, concerned with gratifying its own instincts, is found in everyone. This is remarkable. This is from Plato's Republic. Plato not only anticipates the Freudian unconscious, he also stipulates how desire can override reason and a sense of shame belonging to our ethical compass. It is here that we may see how Plato was the first psychoanalyst, when he articulates the intimate relationship between desire, reason, and morality, how the soul possesses a natural constitution that is instinctually driven, develops habits in relating to others in the environment, and that our true characters awaken during sleep when the soul is at rest, whether this be the rational, gentle, and dominant part, or disquieted passion, unruliness, and anger. In fact, Plato accounts for good and evil within the soul, or as he put it, a better part and a worse part, which is subject to control and self-mastery. When the soul is able to attain a sense of self-consciousness, the more primitive forms of our nature are tamed, which, as he puts it, settles down in a compromise, end quote, between our competing tendencies, only to find a middle ground or a synthetic function where unbridled desires are transformed into lawful order and democratic inclinations. Here are the seeds of Freud's tripartite theory of the mind. Although stemming from Sophocles, following these remarkable passages in Book 9, Plato may be even credited with elaborating upon Oedipal rivalry and competition when he compares a son's insolence, outrage, and autocracy toward others as a reaction formation to a thrifty and niggardly father who personifies self-restraint, renunciation of pleasure, and inner discipline. Here, Plato succeeds in showing how the ruling passions of the unconscious are under the influence of that, quote, tyrant eros, end quote, responsible for every erotic and evil impulse, including the atrocity of murder that lives in utmost anarchy and lawlessness, end quote, in our sleeping souls, which is based in part on habit and nature, in reaction to and defiance of the, quote, control of his father and his laws, end quote. This could read straight out of Freud. It is no accident that Freud referred to psychology as his tyrant. The division of the psyche is further described by Plato as a dialectical structure composed of opposites. For instance, and the Phaedo is what he talks about that. In fact, in all contraries in the laws, where psychological dispositions such as thought, feeling, sensation, perception, memory, and judgment transpire in order to write words in our souls. It is also the harbinger of moral qualities, such as excellence, ends, and virtues. Also aesthetics and the pursuit of knowledge. The soul is also the house of creativity, truth and reality, beauty, and wisdom. Furthermore, the soul is not only the cause of good and evil, right and wrong, but a universal cause of all mental activity, which affects a person's overall character. Being both rational and irrational, of pleasure and pain, the psyche is the essence of man, human. Although Plato states that the psyche possesses temperament and physical constituents that belong to our embodiment, hence showing the interdependence of mind and body, following the pre-Socratics, he ultimately believed the soul was immortal. I will not critique this notion here, given the long contentious debate in the history of philosophy and theology. However, we can metaphysically infer a type of unconscious infinity that we may, by analogy, apply to the soul. What Freud in his two introductory lectures refers to as a timeless, boundless immediacy that is virtually immortal. While Plato provides a rich backdrop to the question, nature, and discourse on the quandaries of the soul, it was Aristotle's treatise on the anima that continued to dominate our conception of mind until modern-day psychology was established as a distinct discipline. For Aristotle, the object of psychology is to discover the essence of soul and its attributes or properties. In book 1 of his treatment on the soul, he lays out the mind-body problem by asking whether the soul is divisible into parts, and if so, whether they are distinct from the body. Here he contextualizes the notion of parts as a plurality of functions with discernible properties as distinct from the whole, as well as the problematic of separating out affections such as sensation, appetite, passion, perception, emotion, etc., from our experiential embodiment, including thinking. Aristotle concludes that in order to act or be acted upon, soul has to possess a body as a prerequisite of its existence. Therefore, any study of the soul falls within, as he put it, the science of nature, as a composite of embodied events. This is the making of modern psychological science. It's in book 2 where Aristotle gives an answer to the question, what is soul? Here he provides his famous distinction of matter as potentiality from form or essence as actuality, and concludes that soul is a compound of the two as life. Here, psyche and soma form a unit or union as a living being. Soul is not only a living thing with degrees of actuality and potentiality, it's an enactment of actualized potential as a capacity, as he puts it. Today, we refer to this as agency. Aristotle continues to delineate various functions, characteristics, or psychic powers of the soul that belong to organized, natural, living bodies, such as self-nutrition, growth, decay, and so forth, with hierarchical degrees of enhancement in animals, such as sensation and perception, and for humans, intellect or thought. For Aristotle, the capacity to sense, perceive, and desire is common to all animal species. For what differentiates the human being from animals is the outgrowth or derivative properties of cognition. Here there are three advanced faculties humans possess. One, imagination, which in turn relies on two, memory, and three, reason, which is unique to the human being. Aristotle viewed imagination as a derivative of sensation, whereby the manifold of sense objects and after images appear to the soul as distinct psychical phenomenon, even while in dreaming. Side note is Aristotle had a nice little essay on dreaming that's worth taking a look at. The distinguished Aristotelian scholar, Sir David Ross, notes that the acts of imagination involve, quote, not a conscious state of mind, but an unconscious modification of the mind, end quote, due to the fact that mental processes are operative before recollection takes place, which is dependent upon memory. Until mind recollects itself, the deposits of sense perception recorded within the tableau of the unconscious, they persist in a state of potentiality before they are made actual by the imaginative faculty. In extending Aristotle's views, we may say that such potentiality, as such, is an unconscious presence that is always there, the task of which is to make it actual through recollection. In fact, Aristotle has another nice essay called On Memory, where he discusses recollection at length. Here he anticipates Hegel's psychology, where there's a sort of unconscious intelligence that mediates images and stored objects within the abyss of the mind. Originally laid down and retained as sensations, these after images, as he calls them, can take on a life of their own, as we may observe in fantasy, and are reproduced by the faculty of imagination as representations that are unconsciously derived. This is why Aristotle states, quote, thinking is different from perceiving and is held to be in part imagination, in part judgment, end quote. Notice that imagination and thought intermingle. Here we may anticipate why Hegel claims, with stipulations, that, quote, fantasy is reason, end quote. In other words, unconscious valences intervene during any act of thinking, especially fantasy. It's important to emphasize that these advanced forms of cognition are epigenetic achievements. They develop from primordial organic processes such as our biological drives, desire, affect, and gain a synthetic organizational ability or endowment responsible for reflective thought and behavior. This is why the soul is determinative. It executes a causal impetus over the life activities of a living thing through animate action as agency. For Aristotle, the soul is the psychic facility that allows us to live as sentient and thinking beings, but with this single caveat: it cannot exist without a body. The standard Ross translation reads, quote, "The soul cannot be without a body, while it cannot be a body. It is not a body, but something relative to a body," end quote. Now, in comparison, I'm going to give you the Creed translation, which is similar. "Neither can the soul exist without the body, nor is it a body. It is not a body, but has something to do with a body, and for this reason, it is present in body," end quote. On the one hand, soul possesses a body, but on the other, it's not a body. In other words, the soul is embodied, but it cannot be reduced to matter or a material substance. This is Aristotle's language for what today we may refer to as non-reductive materialism. If mind is embodied, as inhering within mass extended in space, where the affections of the soul are in mattered accounts, end quote, then what becomes of the question of immateriality generally attributed to the soul? Keep in mind, this question is prefaced on historical Christianization of the word soul, which typically signifies an immaterial, incorporeal, or supernatural independent existence the so-called immortal psyche assumes over the physical cessation of the body at death, where in other languages, such as I mentioned in German earlier, the term soul or Seele is devoid of these theological connotations, as is mind or spirit, Geist. Unlike Plato, for Aristotle, the soul is not an independently existing substance, nor is it incorporeal. It is neither a material object, nor is it separated from the body. In other words, soul is not separable from the body, nor is it conceived as a body. Herein lies the paradox of inseparability of soul from body. While the psyche is not a body, it's not immaterial, yet it remains embodied. Psyche and soma are not different substances. Rather, they are differentiated elements of the same substance, hence conjoined within a monistic structure. Yet Aristotle may be said to introduce a contradiction here, and even waffles on the notion of form and matter being independent of one another. He specifically gets more into the muddled thinking in book 3 of the Anima. While they may be categorically separable, hence thought of as distinct through the act of abstraction, ontologically they're not. So the distinction is categorical, not ontological. And I'll just have a brief digression while I'm thinking about it. This is the same thing for Descartes. Nobody ever gets Descartes right. They always talk about him as an ontological dualist, but if you read his meditations carefully, he's very clear in the very beginning of the synopsis of the meditations that the mind and body always form a unit. They are inseparable. Everything you read in the literature is based on crappy introductory textbooks in philosophy. And it's amazing that people like Robert Stollerow can get away with this stuff. Back to my talk. Furthermore, mind and body are not ontologically identical. Hence, they are not the same, and they cannot be collapsed into one another, contrary to the identification thesis advanced by modern materialism. Nor are they merely categorical distinctions, because the soul qua form transcends its biological counterpart in terms of its capacities, functions, organizational complexity, and self-defining agency, which by definition gives it greater powers in valuing properties matter itself does not intrinsically possess, although sentience, desire, and perception are necessarily embodied and cannot exist independent of soul. Another digression, Aristotle's famous work in the Physics on Causality talks about the 4 dimensions of causality: material, efficient, formal, final. They are all operative in any of these aspects of determinism. So hence, even the talk about the material cause as being the substance or substrate of the raw material of, let's say, our brains, it doesn't mean that that is the motive force behind soul. In fact, he would situate it in form, meaning formal causality, which is a pattern, which is a trajectory of a complex dynamic organization. But now I'll come back to talk. By today's standards, Aristotle has set the stage for a discourse on the irreconcilability of the dialectic between psyche and substance, what we often see in contemporary cognitive neuroscience as a duality or polarity between mind and brain. The tendency today among the biological sciences is to boil down the mind to brain states, or neurochemical, physical, systemic substances. This vitiates the philosophical need to preserve the integrity of soul as a vitalizing, self-directing, regulatory process of generative, valuative, self-creative agency that transpires within the embodied parameters of its natural givenness or thrownness. Cliff notes, we're thrown into a body, but just because we're embodied doesn't mean that we don't have a sense of creative, valuing, causal properties that drive who we are. Aristotle's views on the soul preserves both the natural scientific attitude of explaining the physical world as an empirical object of investigation, as well as valuing the transcendental properties of mind that resist reductionistic strategies hell-bent on displacing its determinative freedom through the mendacity and simple-minded devolution of materialism. As you can probably tell, I don't like materialists. They're very simple thinkers, but I'm not denying the fact that I'm embodied. Although soul is an actuality, it is in itself capacity to actualize itself as the coming into being of potentiality that signals its agentic potency. It is in the prowess of agency that soul achieves its pinnacle as thought. This is one reason why we do not phenomenally equate our minds with our bodies. For our reflective experience of our internal experiences is a higher order accomplishment of self-consciousness, or in Hegelianese, a sublation, Aufheben of mind. We do not relate to ourself as brain, but rather as a transcendental organizational being with a qualitative mediatory purpose as self-imposed pursuit and meaning that determines the course of how we wish to act over our body, despite the fact that our bodies, including brain dependence as supervenience, have functional and organic constraints over how we choose to think and behave. I mean, the fact is that, there's sometimes our bodies will take over. You're not feeling well, you're sick. How could you divorce your mind from your body? But to devolve it into brain only misses the point of the qualia or phenomenology of the lived experience. I remember having an argument with debate with Arnold Modell, who denies free will, denies that something like agency exists. It's just the brain. And I just couldn't understand how he would only think in those terms. What is extraordinary about Aristotle's arguments is that he both venerates the naturalized notion that mind cannot exist independent from our embodiment, what contemporary science would reiterate is simply an empirical fact, while at the same time refusing to reduce mind to matter or material substance, which admonishes scientific prejudices, favoring reductionism and parsimony by allowing mind to enjoy concurrent degrees of freedom in causal efficacy, form, qualia, and self-definition. Here, the existential capacity to think, reflect, choose, and deliberately act qualitatively differentiates the human soul from its simple biological, hence causal, constitution. For Aristotle, the crux of what it is to be a psychic entity or possess mind ultimately subordinates individuality and personal experience to a general collective essence. For soul is universal form that applies to all. This is why soul entails a metaphysical factor. For soul, for it epitomizes a universality within a concrete particularity. We participate of a general impersonal psychic essence that may be said to apply to all people, regardless of historicity, gender, race, location, or time, an anima mundi, so to speak. Because of that, another side digression, Aristotle is saying there's the to be a human being, the essence of which is to have soul. That means it is a direct opposition to postmodern thinking that wants to deny the notion of essence. There is no such thing. Well, that means there's nothing that would equally apply universally to all people. And that, he would say, is untenable. From Aristotle to Hegel and Whitehead, we may see why logic, as the essence of pure thought, thinking about itself and its operations, may be attributed to a supraordinate process animating the universe, what Jung would call the collective unconscious or objective psyche. And what is most peculiar to this universal form is that it obeys an unconscious logic, a logic of the interior, something concealed yet manifest. Setting aside for the moment the ancient tendency to import an immaterial, incorporeal, and immortal dimension to the soul that carries with it naive, incredulous supernatural properties. The Greeks were the first to give serious thought to the essence of the psyche as a complex psychological composition and governance responsible for interceding all human experience, including the quest for the spiritual and the equiprimordiality of desire, pining for satisfaction. To this day, the ancients' meditations on psychic reality remain an unequivocal bedrock for understanding human phenomenon, including the psychodynamics of motivation, cognition, and reason, individual and social psychology, mental well-being and suffering, pathos, communal relations, political and economic unconscious structures, ethical, aesthetic, and cultural cultivation, and the convoluted process of civilization forged on power, aggression, violence, but also love and compassion, social negotiation, and democracy. From tragedy to thanatology, the struggle over bodily passions affective impulses, rational choice, and ethical comportment, including reconciling the good with the bad, pleasure and pain, creativity amongst destruction, truth over opinion, and folly from wisdom, all transpiring within a dialectical underworld, vacillating between sex and death. This is the hallmark of modern consciousness. It is rather remarkable that in all the philosophies of the unconscious, from the summit of German idealism to psychoanalysis, existentialism, and process metaphysics, we may rightfully appreciate what Whitehead means when he says that all of Western European philosophy is merely, quote, a series of footnotes to Plato, end quote. The notion of depth psychology with its topography of soul, including the interdependence of drive, desire, and pathos, instrumental in the ascendance of reason, aesthetics, and ethical self-consciousness, may be viewed as an ancient discovery. But like Hades and the notion of truth, or aletheia in Greek, one that remained hidden in those times, concealed yet always present. Just as the Delphic maxim inscribed in the Pronaos at the Temple of Apollo cautioned all visitors to, quote, know thyself. The psychoanalytic attitude upholds the value of insight and self-knowledge over the shrouded interior of the life within. Okay.
Fantastic, John. Thank you very much. That really sets us up for a good discussion and a good series. So we're not many, so I think rather than, raising hands and all that, just jump in whenever you have a question or so on. Why don't we start actually with just, if you have any clarifications for John and what he said, we can get our discussion going that way. If you want to speak, make sure to unmute yourself.
As nobody else is jumping in, I'll jump in, David, if that's all right. I've actually got probably a couple of things. One from the reading, and one just from the talk now. A couple of sort of contention points. The one from the reading is that as I was going through it, I mentioned before the meeting started that I found it very difficult. It did my head in to put it simply, and I was trying to work out why. And when I was thinking about it, I thought, well, there's some convoluted argument here, and there was a bit when I came to, and I thought, well, it's convoluted, but that's not because it's convoluted. It's because I don't know whether it's valid or not. And there was a bit I came to that suddenly made me realize what I was doubting. And there's a bit on, and if I can just quote, this is, I can't remember from which bit it's from, but a bit from the book. It's on Empedocles. And Aristotle writes, Empedocles, open bracket, and with him all others use the same forms of expression, close bracket, was wrong in speaking of light as traveling, or being at a given moment between the earth and its envelope, its movement being unobservable by us. That view is contrary both to the clear evidence of argument and to the observed facts. If the distance traversed were short, the movement might have been unobservable. But where the distance is from extreme east to extreme west, the draw upon our powers of belief is too great. Now, and that's the end of the quote from Aristotle. And what struck me about that is that that's a very confident argument that what Empedocles was saying, that light travels, Aristotle was saying confidently was wrong for two reasons. And yet we know now, we now know that it's actually correct, or at least it's correct as far as science can tell us. So I was then left sort of doubting, well, if Aristotle's argument on something that we can measure, like light, we now know is wrong, how can we trust in Aristotle's argument about soul? So I was left, it did my head in, and then it did my confidence in Aristotle in as well, I think.
Well, Steve,
can I put that back to John then?
that's a red herring, Steve. You're throwing people off the scent here just because he's gotten some argument wrong here. And, 2,500 years ago, before the rise of modern science, doesn't mean that it negates his argument on soul. So, in fact, Aristotle was probably the first scientist who systematically tried to bring together the natural sciences that we know today, logic. I mean, he single-handedly built the institution of logic. I mean, he was interested in biology. So anyway, the point is, yeah, he got that wrong. But why would that negate the value of the other arguments?
Well, it doesn't negate it. And I mean, just as an aside, the point about science is, I don't know if you've heard my talk on Popper, but actually Popper thinks that things started to go wrong with Aristotle as far as science is concerned. But it's not that this argument negates the other, but when we look back at Aristotle's argument, it is an argument that was made, nearly 2,500 years ago. And so how can it be relevant to what we do know a lot more now, not necessarily about soul, but how can we have confidence in that as an argument? I mean, there are lots of other arguments about the nature of consciousness that have, sort of come along since then that may be more relevant to the debate about soul. Consciousness studies is a field that has been growing rapidly over the last half a century. And, so the question I would pose is then why should we pay attention more to Aristotle's writing on soul than maybe some of the more recent writers? And just to give you an example, this actually relates to the second point, because you dismissed the point about the idea of there being no free will. But the latest research shows it's very interesting that when we think we make conscious decisions, actually those decisions can be predicted from activity in the unconscious, sometimes several seconds before we think we make the decision. So the nature of free will is really something that I'm not saying we don't have free will, but I think it's right to question it, or at least question the relation of free will to the psyche and the mind, given the evidence of unconscious studies.
Okay, all right, Steve. Let's start with that. Why? Okay, I am going to grant you what you said, that unconsciously there's processes that even we can empirically demonstrate are operative that drive cognition. But why not assume that the unconscious processes that are operative in consciousness are in fact free? The notion of psychic determinism is that it's not that something has been predetermined, but it's something that is executing a certain agentic function. And here I think this would could extend to Aristotle. So the soul, unconscious soul, is more or less making certain decisions. Why don't we call it freed will instead of free will? It's freed. it has been expressed. It's manifesting itself in the only way that it can, and that's through conscious experience and demonstration. So I have a whole argument against free will arguments and causality and things that are quite compatible, I think, with unconscious determinism.
So I think Roger, are you wanting to come in?
Yes, please. I'd like to see if we can get back to, in a way, that a bit more on the theme of the seminar, which is on Aristotle's view of the psyche, rather than questioning how we can believe him or freedom and determinism, except that's regard to psyche. I'd like to get back, if we can. One question I have, and I read the books in preparation. It was really interesting to think about the influence of Aristotle's thinking on Jung's. I was really struck, and I was wondering if this, John, you could say more about this. I was really struck, for instance, by a line in the first book where he says he roots thinking in imagination, and he roots both in the body. That might not be perfect syntax, but that thinking is a form of imagination, and imagination is embodied. I find that absolutely fascinating, and I think goes to the heart of Jung's model of both imagination and thinking, insofar as thinking is rooted in archetypal fantasy, for instance. I was wondering if you had any other thoughts on that, John.
Well, you said it so eloquently, Roger. This is something I've grappled with as well. Is there really a clean-cut distinction between desire, affect, and a cognition? And of course, imagination has to be in that mix. You wouldn't have wishes and fantasies if it wasn't for desire, wanting something, or drive impulses, seeking out objects for satisfaction. But then you have to have imagination in order to recollect images that we've internalized over time or memorialized, and we hook up our fantasy or desire to the object in our mind. And yet at the same time, a lot of creative, imaginative thought is rooted in reason. So I agree with the premise that Roger's bringing up, that we can't just separate these, what they typically call faculties of mind, out from one another. There probably have to be some kind of on a continuum of how they're enacted, or how they are expressed, where there might be certain dominant elements that are coming over while occluding others, but that doesn't mean they disappear from that psychic organization. But I'll defer to what others have to think about that.
Thank you. I'll just follow up with this thought, which of course is that Freud and Jung were classically trained. And so we often read, say, Jung on the psyche, and we forget that, we sort of think that he's kind of winging it or making it up as he goes along. But of course, what is part of the real value of the seminar is to realize that Jung's term has a long history, and Jung would have been very aware of the history of the term in his own even development of it. And so that for me is really, very interesting.
I find it fascinating, John, were you describing about the soul is not the soul sort of hangs around with the body. They hang out together in a way. And I mean, Hillman says stuff similar to that, that the soul is very intimate and personal and related to the body. And there's an interesting thing where Jung says, that the soul is related to the personal unconscious, and spirits are related to the collective unconscious. So if you lose your soul, if you lose your personal, engagement with living in your body, then you're in trouble, and you want to go see a shaman or whatever to get your soul back. But if you get possessed by a spirit, that means you're ill. So you want to go to the shaman to get rid of the spirit. So I thought that was interesting, that somehow soul is intimate and near to hand, and spirits are dangerous to human beings.
That's interesting, David.
Please 40%.
A thought just crossed my mind because I just checked out when Plato and Aristotle lived. These are thoughts that are taking place at a time when the Greeks worship a pantheon of gods rather than, the one Christian God. In the time of Jung, I just seems rather elegant. It's an elegant way to think, to be thinking, as opposed to a god worship that is, many gods, a pantheon of gods. Any comments on that, John?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure what to say. I think a lot of this has to do with the custom of the time and place and culture you grow up in. Certainly hasn't changed for over 1 billion Hindus either. But I think on one hand, I think Aristotle is the one who had to differentiate himself from his mentor Plato, and instead of locating, the universe within the pantheon of pantheism of the dead, he pulls in a godhead, but an impersonal one when he posits the unmoved mover. So he's rather, advanced in that sense at that point. He's, and maybe an argument can be made that he prefigures a or theist God.
But then aren't most pantheistic situations, if you like, there is somewhere the big God or the main God or the fundamental God, or so even in Hinduism there is one God, and in lots of African cultures where there are many different spirits and gods, there is still, the one big God. So I think to divide monotheism and polytheism in some kind of clear-cut surgical way. I don't think that really works, at least as far as I can tell.
Well, if that's the case, David, which I have no expertise in, that would mean that psyche, regardless of plurality, is looking for a unification principle. That there's something about the psyche that seeks out integration, seeks out synthesizing, whatever terms we want to use, but particularly, yeah, go ahead.
In your comments, you made that interesting thing about, it's the soul is one, it's collective. That's a sort of like a world soul sort of idea, that it isn't just chopped up into bits. I don't know if that's what you're referring to.
Well, I'm still struggling with that concept, so I'll reserve judgment.
Hi, John. I don't really have a question. I'm going to ask you for a bit of clarification. I'm fairly new to Aristotle, so I'm still coming to terms with trying to read him. I understand in book one where he's talking about the in my vocabulary, the interaction between the soul and the body and the place of emotion and the home of emotion. So correct me if I'm wrong, is Aristotle actually saying then in his proposition that emotions, feelings, anger, passions, and so do they live in an interactivity, a place of interactivity between the body and the soul, that they, independent of the other, they don't exist, therefore they live in a conjunction of the two? Is that what he's proposing?
Well, this is where it's unclear. I think it's up to how we interpret things. But on one hand, I would say yes, there has to be an interaction between soul and body, so to speak. But more specifically, that there have to be interrelations between our various, I guess, what we could call self states today. So they're not ontologically separate. Let's say, for sake of argument, we talk about cognition and emotions, and we talk about urges or drives or desire, and we tend to compartmentalize those things as if like they're all separate things, when in fact, no, they're not. There's a confluence of energies that are happening. I mean, who just has a pure thought that doesn't have some form of an affect attached to it, even if it's passive or minimal? And who even has a thought that doesn't desire to think something? So meaning that there's an impetus. So all these things have to be, I would argue they have to be operative, and we're only kind of dissecting them to look at them perhaps more as a scientific object of study, rather than in reality, can we separate those things out? So if that helps, but I do think that he would have to say there's a relational dynamic that's taking place between these various motivations or forces in the psyche. And as we would more into our in today's standards, I think we would attribute a lot more unconscious activity to them that he would, or the Greeks would in their time. That wasn't to say, though, that they didn't anticipate unconscious processes.
Yes, I think I'm a little bit clearer. I guess I'm coming to terms with his way of expressing the relationship between things. So yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Sure.
Milton Munitz, in his review of Burnett's fragments, and in his discussion of the very topic that you're talking about with Aristotle, said that he thought for Aristotle, he couldn't be as definite because of his relationship with Plato, and that he was attempting to move away from Platonic ideals into the idea of a more interactive model. And he thought that some aspects of another thing that he found that went beyond Burnett's fragments in Thales led some of Aristotle to that. But I wanted to comment on the notion, about interaction, the interactivity that's in terms of the idea of some being, around this. It seems to me that Mary McCarthy and a couple of others have really said that this is quite universal, across religions, and thinks about it as an aspect of psychology. You forced me to talk a little about that next time, but that's all I will say. But I wanted to thank you for getting us to read Aristotle again, which I hadn't done for a very long time, and also to go back to some aspects of the pre-Socratic philosophies, which I think were very interesting.
Well, thanks, Steve. Because David gets all the credit, though. He wanted to start off the seminar with Aristotle, so I'm going to give the credit where credit's due. I'd like to take up Steve Meyer's challenges again, because I'd like to hear more from Steve about what he thinks is antiquated in Aristotle's thinking about what the psyche is.
Well, it's not necessarily that I think his thinking is antiquated. I think at the time it was revolutionary, but I think what the point I'm making is that, especially in the last, in the last half century, we've made quite a number of advances in terms of our understanding. I think, one of the points you made earlier was, why not assume that there is, I think you used the expression freed will, and I wasn't wanting to make an assumption about anything. I was actually suggesting that the research that's being done at the moment is throwing an awful lot of things into the air, an awful lot of things, not only in terms of studies of, unconscious processing, neurology, but also studies in physics and the nature of the world and the nature of reality, that even physicists nowadays are saying that, suggesting, some of them, the way they put it is that things don't exist until they are perceived, and it's only when they are perceived that they are called into existence, and it changes the whole nature of the way that we look at things. So when we go back to look at the question of the soul. And I acknowledge Roger's point, particularly about there being lots of initial threads there that you can see being traced in terms of Freudian Jungian thought about the structure and the nature of the psyche and so on. I just think that the advances we've made in the last 50 years do raise a lot of questions that actually cut across some of the claims that that Aristotle is making about, I mean, the example of light was a simple one, but I found it difficult to accept that necessarily that the logic of his argument in terms of the nature of the soul and what it is and what it isn't and so on, whether that is correct or not, because it is, we're in such an age of discovery that things really are up in the air. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. And I think the reference to, sorry, the other thing about logic is that I think in the last 20 years I've lost my confidence in logic, because even now, with fields like paraconsistency and mathematics, Aristotelian logic is being challenged. With principles of non-contradiction and so on. So I'm not saying anything really other than, I think there are lots of big questions here, and I don't want to make any assumptions. And I'm really in a sort of at a stage of saying, I'm not really sure about any of this. Because of the evidence of that has been emerging over the last half century.
But I'm going to just make one comment, and then so John could include this. But if you were going to look at some of those studies, most of which are multiple factor model studies that use some form of multiple regression, the amount of things that are unexplained in any of those studies, which is generally much higher than what is explained. And I think that's part of the problem. When you get a correlation, I'll just do a simple correlation of 0.6 or 0.7, which is a high correlation, where you get a series of things that are correlated variables, you find that explains, 0.6 correlation explains 36% of the variance. And so one could make an argument that with all of these new studies and multiple factor models, what we've seen is that there is a large amount of unexplained variance, however you want to conceive of it, whether you want to conceive of that as free will or not. I wouldn't, but that's certainly one way, rather than think that a variety of these studies put down Aristotle. So I would think more in terms of multiple factor models and some of the mathematical models that are being put forth. Anyway, I'm sorry, John, but I thought maybe that argument would help you. Unlikely.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, here's just my bias, is that, I see when we even use the word science, it's like a dog whistle. It's as if it's saying, this is the touchstone to truth and is the epistemological window into reality. And when I see there's a lot of ideologies in science lingo and language, and but it's not to say that I wouldn't admire scientific achievements. The term means something differently today than it meant in ancient times. I mean, science means something entirely different today because of how we've evolved as human beings. The thing about research says this, studies support that. I mean, anybody can find a body of knowledge or a literature base that would support a certain premise or a certain argumentation. The thing about the physicists is say nothing exists until it's observed, they're metaphysicians masquerading as scientists. I mean, come on. That means that when something's observed, it pops up ex nihilo, and I create it through my subjectivity of observation. It says that you can't have an independently existing object that has independence of consciousness, that is real, meaning that it is extant, and it would be, by definition, have to be there without an observer or without a mind or consciousness observing it, because it's epistemic transcendent. You don't have to know something in order for it to exist. But when the scientist wants to say they create it through their observation, isn't that a convenient theory, or a wordplay, or a language game? And not only that, there's an inherent contradiction, because the physicists will also want to bring in the unconscious factor. They want to talk about dark matter, dark energy, that we don't know, we don't see, but it's holding 95% of the universe together. I mean, this is not my field, of course, but you know, we're all using our different languages and creative manners.
But I just want to say I'm not using the way that you're portraying science there. I'm not viewing it in the same way. So we do have different portrayals of science that we're dealing with. And I think one of the words that I would pick up on in you know, the points that you just made is you know, when there is an inherent contradiction. And I think that's what a lot of the scientists are doing at the moment. And the reason that they get to a conclusion like, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, 94% of the universe is made up of dark matter, which we can't see, is because there are inherent contradictions in their observations. And it's looking at those contradictions. And, you know, that's how Einstein came up with his, you know, theory of relativity, because he looked at some inherent contradictions in electromagnetism. And it took, you know, several decades before it was, you know, empirically demonstrated that his theory had some validity. His theory has also been undermined by further work as well. And so, you know, and I just return again to Popper, that actually what Popper says is that all science is myth, and what we're dealing with is different myths. And therefore we need to recognize that any progress we make is looking at trying to improve our myths. And how do we improve our myths? And that's the question that Popper is asking. So, you know, and in that sense, I'm not saying that, you know, science says this and science says that. And even with going back to Stephen's point about correlations, I mean, you know, correlations are terrible. I mean, there's some great websites that show some really strange correlations between all sorts of things that are completely unconnected. Because of course, correlation, you know, as the proverb says, you know, isn't causality. And, you know, so those types of studies really one has to handle with kid gloves and so on. When I'm talking about, you know, the things that we don't understand, like dark matter, like the nature of decision making, when you look at unconsciousness, these aren't correlations. These are, you know, these dark matter is a contradiction. Maybe there are some correlations in the unconscious aspects, but neurological studies, but they're able to make predictions about our decisions before we actually think they make the decisions for ourselves, which, you know, is really quite a mind-blowing concept, I think. And that process has been demonstrated time and time again over the last half century.
Those predictions, though,
you know, you're making me really nervous, Steve. You're making me really nervous, because you seem to say that free will is when the consciousness makes a decision. And I don't really quite know, I mean, maybe I'm sound like an old priest or something. It sounds like you want to get rid of the unconscious, that it's all consciousness and empirical studies. but what happens to the unconscious as, say, experienced in psychotherapy? Or, you're saying there's various sources. How can you talk about the origin of a dream, for example, or the origin of somebody's desire for something, and that desire organizes their life in a certain way? I don't know, you seem to value consciousness way more than I would.
Well, that's maybe that's that's the poor way that I've expressed it, because that's not the case. But what I'm saying is this demonstrates the problem with the nature of what is free will? What do we mean by free will is a valid question to look at. And, is it making conscious decisions, or is it taking responsibility for the whole of our own psyche, which includes the unconscious, which is the wider issue, which comes up in psychotherapy. So I don't know how you got to that conclusion of it seems like I want to get rid of the unconscious. No, by no means not. I recognize that we're sort of definitely not. So that's not the direction that I'm going in. But what I am saying is it does raise questions over what the nature of free will is. So, that's why I'm sympathetic to those who put forward the argument. I'm not saying I agree with them, but sympathetic to those who put forward the argument that actually we don't have free will, and maybe in many situations, and it's not a binary thing, do we have free will or not? To what extent do we have free will, perhaps, in different situations? And there's the outer context and the inner context, the objective psyche within as well. So I'm definitely not suggesting wanting to get rid of the unconscious or play down its importance.
I think most people would equate, whether I have free will, that I would be ego, consciousness, to say that when somebody says I have free will, I think then in common language, that's what they're talking about is consciousness, yeah. And that the unconscious is something beyond their control, godlike forces that are beyond their control. Even though they may come from the unconscious of an individual's psyche, the experience of it is that free will has not come from I.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, and I think that's where people who argue against, who say we don't have free will, I think that's the perspective that they come from when they make that argument. So I think you make a good point, Cassie.
Thank you. And I like the way you talk about science being a myth. I wonder how much of this excitement over dark matter is just an amplification of unconscious or soul. The soul is talking about, the soul maybe holding the body together or directing the body, or, what's this relationship of movement like? The dark matter is almost like the web that matter is hung upon. And I wonder what that relationship between dark matter and matter is like between soul and body. Or
is there a relationship between dark matter and soul? Pauli and Jung were talking about the relationship between, Psyche and Psyche, and one wonders whether there is something going on with soul that is, just at the moment so far beyond our understanding. And it's the hard problem of consciousness is to know where it comes from, but that there are so many questions there that it is an area to be looked at.
Sorry, was that you, John?
No, go ahead, Roger.
My little contribution to this conversation is to say, I don't think you will ever find the old debate between freedom and determinism by looking in neurology and biochemistry. They can search there forever. All you are going to find is everything functioning, according to the. You're going to find what you see. What you put in there and the assumptions that's there. You can't find conceptual questions, fundamental conceptual questions, by looking at neurology. For one thing, as I think Owen said, the neurology can never explain the neurologist's love of neurology. In principle, you'll get there. To explain the neurologist's love of neurology, you have to look at the world in which, and history and cultural life and so on, in which the neurologist is embedded. You won't find it in the brain. The other thing, my other comment, if I just make another one, is I think that the I don't know if anybody's written about this, but it seems to me that this rather, what I think is in a way a rather sterile debate between freedom and determinism becomes psychologically much richer when we psychologize it and we think of it in terms of tragedy, and we think of how in tragedy people, the heroes, the people do make choices, but they do make choices that have been ordained or predestined by the gods. And I think then we are in a psychologically much richer way of thinking about that issue than something that is an abstraction that, for me at least, isn't particularly meaningful. Thank you.
What I find interesting is this emphasis on, like you say, neurology, and it won't explain something. What I find interesting is that perhaps it's an expression of, it's almost like a modern myth. And that's what, drawing on what Steve said again about science being a myth, that this is the modern myth, the emphasis on the material, the logical, the rational.
Well, yes, and it's also, of course, an alchemy. I think it was Robert Steele in his book on hermeneutics on Freud and Jung made the comment that the modern neurologist or neuroscientist is very much like the old alchemist, looking for the true gold and not in the grey matter of the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if we subscribe to the idea that inner and outer, so within as without, whatever the phrase goes, that if that sense of neurology, the understanding of neurology is then coupled with an understanding of psychology, then perhaps you could get somewhere. The same way with alchemy, there's an external understanding, there's an external goal, but also that as also an internal process at the same time.
But what you've just expressed is much closer. What some expressions have been, seem to me to be a very old version of neuroscience. That in most neuroscience studies, or even in predicting unconscious factors to determine a decision, there's a recent study that's going to come out that shows that some of those unconscious things really were from our point of view, or from at least one psychoanalytic point of view, pre-conscious. But most neuroscientists put in a number of factors and are not only dealing with brain factors, but also things at different levels. And so that if you talked about dream formation, one factor, in my view, would be REM sleep, which would give a much higher probability of a dreamlike mentation occurring. That's one biological factor, but it's certainly not the only factor that will determine the occurrence of a dream, nor is it certainly the only factor that will determine the content of a dream. But some things will be predictive. We did a study that showed the amount of eye movements during REM sleep and the amount of PGO spikes during REM sleep will determine levels of activity in a dream. But that's not the only thing that will do that. And then there are other factors too, nor could we explain a lot of other things in a dream. So that it seems to me the version of brain scientists only talking about, because another factor that we took a look at is, pre-sleep stimuli in terms of, and then other personality factors that we looked at. So that most neuroscientists.
Sorry.
No,
sorry. I was gonna say thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, would look at a variety of factors, but I think that's what you were saying.
But then that to me, that supports Aristotle in his idea of body and soul. Something that matter.
We need to wrap this up, and I really want to thank everybody for their contributions. and thank John especially for his getting us started. I don't know if you have any final thoughts, John. John, you there? He's somewhere up in Canada.
I
Okay,
think John
so,
is frozen.
yeah, our next session is on the 23rd of November, and Dr. Steve Ellman is going to guide us through the instincts and their vicissitudes by Freud. That's in the standard edition 14. So
Just
look
a word,
forward.
the reason for that is to look at a seminal point in Freud's theorizing that starts to influence a variety of people after him, and where he leaves a certain kind of model that unfortunately some people are still taking. So it's trying to look at the movement of Freud and how Freud has at least influenced some people. I'm going to go particularly to Bion, but to Klein and beyond.
Okay,
But
that's great. So look forward to that. 23rd of November, I'll send the Zoom link round and
okay.
you're free to share it with anybody else. That's fine. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for this. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks a
David.
lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
both. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, David and John.